Welcome back to the Money Master Podcast. This is a special series for Book Club, and the book is Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. If you've heard of this book, it's a fantastic read. Nick, Connie, Tori here, all ready to talk about the psychology of money. So get ready to follow along.
This is the Money Master Podcast from Brindle and Bay Wealth Management with Tori Tenhagen, Connie Davis, and certified financial planner Nick Davis.
All right, welcome back. We're all here. We've got our books open.
Yeah, you may hear page turning throughout the podcast.
Yeah.
Page shuffling.
There may be a little more silence than usual because we may be looking at our notes.
Find our quotes.
I'm actually really excited about doing this book club. I love to read. I don't read a lot of finance books because normally they're boring, right? But this one, psychology, it really gets into
Psychology of
the
money.
psychology.
Why should people read this?
Really interesting.
Why do you think people should read this book or listen to this podcast?
I think it would help them to understand not only where they might be coming from when they make money choices or how they decide to do things with money, but when they see what other people do as well. I think it's very helpful. And I think it'll probably help them it's helping me to shift my perspective on money and how I do things or how I see other people do things.
Yeah, I think it starts to point out maybe biases you didn't know were there that are just innate, they're natural, but why? Why do I feel that way, or why does someone else feel so different?
Yeah. There's a lot of anecdotes in this book, a lot of great stories. Morgan Housel is a young writer, from what I can tell, and he's brilliant. He has a second book called Things That Never Change that I'm also in the middle of reading, and you're like, this guy's got to be 100 years old. He's so wise. So with that, chapter 1 is called No One's Crazy.
No one's crazy.
No one is crazy. Your personal experiences with money may make up maybe 0.00001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works. Meaning the point is, how you think the world works is probably what influences you the most. So what stood out to you in this chapter?
Well, starting with that quote, that was one thing that stood out to me. You have your own perspective of how the world works, and you think everybody else thinks that's how it is too. I remember, we have 4 kids, and as they get older, they realize, oh, not everybody's family dynamics are the same as ours.
We operate different.
Yes. And I think it's the same when it comes
Your
to money.
Your experience
Yes.
affects the way that you view the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they use a story, and they talk about the Great Depression. Morgan Housel talks about the Great Depression, and it was page 12, and he says that the Great Depression marked millions of Americans inwardly for the rest of their lives, but there was a range of experiences. 25 years later, as he was running for president, John F. Kennedy was asked by a reporter what he remembered about the Great Depression, and he said, I don't have any firsthand knowledge of the Depression. My family came from one of the great fortunes of the world, and we were worth more then than ever. We had bigger houses, we had more servants, we traveled more. He said, about the only thing that I saw directly was when my father hired some of the gardeners just to try to give them a job so they could eat. He said, I didn't really learn about the Depression until I went to Harvard and read about it. So the very big contrast here between how people experience life.
Well, and I mean, generation to generation. As a millennial, you look back at my grandparents and people who save leftovers and all kinds of food, and we're like, why? But because they've seen so closely that time,
right.
Whether they lived through it or not, they were way closer to it than I ever could dream of. I've only read about it in history books. I was not directly affected by it.
Yeah. So the Kennedy story was one. The other story he mentioned was how Germany and Japan were affected differently than the United States during the same period, meaning Germany and Japan went through such a horrible time in the 40s that their people had to live on 1,000 calories a day ration. They couldn't produce enough food. During the same period of time, 1941 to 45, the United States experienced a doubling of the stock market. So 2 different perspectives at the same time, and just changes your worldview. And he relates this back to how if you were born in 2 different periods of time, you might view the world completely differently. Like you might be much more risk averse or willing to take risk depending upon what your experience was when you were growing up. If your parents were really struggling to make it, then maybe you're very, very cautious, right? If your parents had an abundance, well, maybe you're much more free with your money and free with your risk.
I think I've told y'all this. I know we've talked about it in my family, but I grew up a pastor's kid and we were tight a lot of my life. And then my dad went back into the oil industry and their paychecks changed. And my sister grew up with a very different environment than I did. Like she has a very different worldview.
Yeah.
Because she didn't grow up as on a budget as I did. And
exactly.
So
it's kind of like first kid versus last kid. Yeah, first kid versus third kid born, right?
Yeah. Not just personality, but I'm much more a penny pincher than she is. Just where the time and environment you grew up in.
Yeah. And sometimes I'll scratch my head and think, what are they doing? Like, why are they buying this or spending money on that or, whatever? And it's right. It's because of how we were raised, what era or time frame or what our family environment was like when we were younger.
Right.
We just carry that on.
So his main point for the chapter was to just recognize that we don't make decisions based on spreadsheets as much as we do by our mindset. And our mindset is really informed by our experience. So a lot of times with stock markets, we talk about anchoring bias, heuristics, things that you remember that caused to affect you the way you think about money today. Like a big one was 2007, 2008. People lost a lot of money, and that really caused them to be very risk averse for a long time. 10 years passes, everything went up. They look backwards and say, oh man, I shouldn't have been so risk averse. Like that really affected me because I wasn't as aggressive or I wasn't even just properly allocated because I was afraid because of all the money I lost, right? So those things really affect us. So that was chapter 1. Anything else from chapter 1?
I would say my last thing is on page 19. He said, you don't have to agree with their reasoning. So if you think that somebody's doing something crazy, like you don't have to agree with them, right? With their reasoning because they have their own reason, right?
I underline just below you. What you're doing seems crazy, but I kind of understand why you're doing it.
Yeah.
And that made me think about what we do with all of our financial plans. Before we get to any of the numbers, we say, what's your goal? What does money mean to you? What are your values? Because I don't have to understand what their values are. That's their personal thing. Then I can understand why they might want to do what they want to do with their money. I need to understand.
They don't need to have your values.
No.
You need to understand their values.
That's personal to them, and I need to understand that before I help them decide where their money's going to go.
Yes, very well said. Because it's like, it's helping you to understand where a person is coming from, right? What has formed their worldview?
And why is it important?
Money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Cool. Anything else? Love the book. There's 20 chapters in this book, so we'll cover 2 or 3 chapters per episode. Hey there. Quick break to let you know that each week I send out an email. It's called Nick's Memo. Super creative name, I know. But this isn't your normal market commentary. It's my thoughts to help you make sense of what's going on in the financial world. So for example, I'll give you a few of the last week's headlines. One of them was called Life Cycle of Bull Markets. And I talk about the 4 phases of bull markets and how you can tell which phase that we're in. Or another topic the week before that was called Comfort is a Moving Target. And I talked about the crises that we hear about, that we see, that we genuinely face all the time. It is disturbing, but how to put that into perspective and be okay regardless of what we're hearing and seeing. And one more topic for you, a couple weeks before that, is what does it take to feel wealthy? And that was based on an interesting study about how much money people have, and yet they still feel they don't feel wealthy. So what does it take to feel wealthy? So if you're interested in getting that every Friday, then all you have to do is text us the word MEMO. That's MEMO. And you're going to text it to our business line at 214-988-9178. That's 214-988-9178. And we'll get you subscribed to the weekly memo. Chapter 2, Luck and Risk. Nothing is as good or as bad as it seems.
I found this chapter to be quite enlightening. Like, you don't think about how much luck has a role in your in your world, how successful or not successful or how things play out. And the story that they told was about Bill Gates and that he went to only one of the high schools in the world that had a computer.
Yeah.
And so
A little bit of luck
that.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's 1 in a million,
Yeah.
right?
If he'd have been born anywhere else,
Yeah.
what would have been
Right.
different? Yeah.
Exactly. And on the opposite end of that is risk. You know, same powers, you know, kind of playing, but on the opposite side, one of his friends that he knew since 8th grade, Kent Evans, he would have been the third partner with Bill Gates. However, he didn't even get to graduate high school because he was in a mountaineering accident.
Yeah.
Again, they told statistics and it was like 1 in a million chances.
Right.
Right. But even in our finances, you know, how much luck.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Is in
and that
there.
goes back to people who, you know, that the first thing that comes to mind is people who are like, well, I can time the market, I get it right. And it's like, it's that there's a quote on page 29. It's possible that I made a good decision, that had an 80% chance of making money, and I just happened to end up on the side of the unfortunate 20%. Like, you can make some good decisions. There are people who make wise, good decisions, but there are also some luck at play.
Or
And
you have to make enough decisions to make your own luck.
Right. You get lucky that time.
Yeah.
But what about the next time?
Well, he says in the book, in the chapter somewhere, if 100% of your outcomes were going to always happen, like that's just not the way the world works, right? 100% of your outcome, your efforts are not going to happen, right? But you have to have enough of those efforts
Right.
Yeah.
to make it work.
One of the quotes is, one lucky break or one supremely shrewd decision, can we tell them apart?
Yep.
And from decision to decision, you may not be able to tell them apart, you know?
Right. Yeah. So it's talking about Bill Gates and Kent Evans, who, you know, Kent died in a mountaineering accident. It says that for every Bill Gates, there's a Kent Evans who is just as skilled and driven, but ended up on the other side of the life roulette. So there's, you know, years ago, I used to own a vending company. Years and years ago, I owned 3,000 vending machines, and we had multiple employees servicing the routes. And this all started because I flew into Boca Raton, Florida, and bought a business from a guy. And this guy was a very impressive guy. I mean, I was younger. I was a lot younger. This is many years ago. And I would say, boy, you have a nice car. You have a nice house. You know, he's into real estate. He was selling his vending business and getting out of it. And he'd say, you know, he goes, I'm very lucky. I'm very fortunate. And I always thought that was weird because it's like, yeah, it's about work. It's about effort. You put the effort in. It's not about luck. But as I got older, I realized it's both.
Yeah.
Right? It's both. And they're neither, you know, not as good as you think and not as bad as you think, right? It's just people aren't as good as you think and people aren't as bad as you think. Investments aren't as good as you think and they're not as bad as you think or as it seems, because there's a little bit of luck, you know, intertwined into it all.
And that's another quote on page 34. Bill Gates said, success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. And I think that's someone, like, I think, you know, from him, like, he probably realizes the weight of, I know I was born in the town with that computer.
Yep.
I know some things helped me along the
Yeah.
way that weren't my decision.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's a good one. It also talks about, you know, he compared a story. This book is full of stories, but he compared Cornelius Vanderbilt and John D. Rockefeller. And what he said was that, you know, Vanderbilt built a railroad empire. And one of his business advisors leaned in to tell him one day that every transaction he agreed to basically broke the law. And Vanderbilt said, my God, John, you don't suppose that you can run a railroad in accordance with the statutes of the state of New York, do you? And the author, Morgan, says, my thought when reading this was, that attitude is why he was so successful. Laws didn't accommodate railroads during Vanderbilt's day, so he said, to hell with it. And he went ahead with it anyway. And then you kind of think about, you know, how he could have ended up on the other side of things, right? So he says, how dangerous is this analysis? No sane person would recommend flagrant crime as an entrepreneurial trait. So you can easily imagine Vanderbilt's story turning out much differently than it did. An outlaw whose young company collapsed under court order, right? So you have people who are very criticized for what they do, breaking laws, but they become great people. But you got who knows how many people that
because they were
end
successful.
up being criminals.
Because they were successful. Oh, good. You
Right.
bucked the
It worked
system. You
out.
pushed through. You did
Somehow
it. You're
you came
so
out on the
great.
right side of things.
But if they'd have failed, we would have said, well, that was really dumb.
Yes. Same thing with John D. Rockefeller. Same story. Says, you know, he was frequently circumventing the law, and a judge once called his company no better than a common thief. And he's often portrayed by historians as a cunning, business, smart man. And but it just really depends on the shift in that narrative, right? You're really close to innovation, but you could end up on the wrong side of things. I don't know this to be true, but Billy the Kid, I don't know true history of this, but I think I've heard a rumor that Billy the Kid kind of thought he was on the right side of the law, and it turned out that he wasn't, or meaning the other side won or whatever. I don't know any truth to that, but that's kind of the point, right?
Something that I had underlined on page 28, Morgan Housel, he was able to ask the economist Robert Shiller, who had won the Nobel Prize in economics, what do you want to know about investing that we can't know? And Robert Shiller responded, the exact role of luck in successful outcomes. That truly would be amazing.
Yeah.
Well, and
that's a good point.
It gives credibility to luck. There is some luck at play, and it's part of it.
So the moral of the story here is you have to do enough stuff to create your own luck. I always talk about optimism. Like, what is optimism? And optimism isn't a belief that everything's just going to be okay. Optimism is a belief that there's going to be some setbacks, but ultimately things are going to be okay. And it's not negating the fact that you're going to have some unlucky outcomes, but if you put enough effort in, right?
Yeah.
So here's kind of a last chapter, last paragraph, or last sentence that I'll read, and if you all have anything else you can say, we can. But he says, and it kind of sums this up very well, but more important is that as much as we recognize the role of luck in success, the role of risk means that we should forgive ourselves and leave room for understanding when judging failures. Nothing is as good or as bad as it seems.
Yeah, that's really good. The last thing that really stood out to me, and I think really sums this up, is the letter that Morgan Housel wrote to his son.
I was going to read the same thing, so I'm glad you.
So he said, some people are born into families that encourage education. Others are against it. Some are born into flourishing economies encouraging of entrepreneurship. Others are born into war and destitution. I want you to be successful, and I want you to earn it. But realize that not all success is due to hard work, and not all poverty is due to laziness. Keep this in mind when judging people, including yourself.
Wow.
Yeah. And I circled that too. I had highlighted it. And we had conversations with our son about this. He's 8. Because even already in school, he's recognizing, well, this kid does this different, or their family life's different, or why this. And because you start to see it play out, you start to see different environments affecting people differently. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so we've had this conversation about, you were born into this family and that's good in these ways. And there might be some things that we don't know are not great. We're not perfect parents, but here's the other playouts of this for other people.
Right.
And you can't really judge them for that.
So it makes what you're saying, what you just said, makes me think about how we feel about people who don't have enough money, right? The poor of the world. In that hard question, is it because they didn't take effort or because they had a disadvantage? It's probably not an easy answer. Dr. Jordan Peterson likes to say, it's complex. It's not, the simple answer is usually wrong when it comes to these things. It's kind of the opposite, right? The simple answer is usually wrong on these types of topics. And it could be both, it could be either, it could be that they had a disadvantage and also they didn't put forth an effort, or people that have an advantage don't put forth an effort, right? The point is, keep that in mind. Some wisdom for the times, right?
I think that's all we have, guys. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was, just great talking about the book. And for our listeners, The Psychology of Money, Morgan Housel. Grab your own copy, read it, and send us an email at hello@brindleandbay.com. Send us your comments. We'd love to hear from you. And be sure to like the episode and share it with your friends.
Nick Davis is an investment advisor representative of Brindle and Bay Financial Advisors, a registered investment advisor. The show is for informational purposes only. Any exposure to ideas and financial vehicles discussed should not be considered financial advice or a recommendation to buy or sell a financial vehicle. You should consult a qualified financial, tax, or legal professional before taking any action. This program is not endorsed by the Social Security Administration or any other government agency. Annuity guarantees rely solely on the financial strength and claims paying ability of the issuing company. Insurance licensed in Texas, number 1188639. Brindle and Bay Wealth Management is affiliated with Brindle and Bay Financial Advisors.
Hey, it's Nick here. I know that many of our listeners like to read books about financial planning, and I wrote a book called A Wealth of Wisdom, and in it I share a story about my grandpa and his successful retirement. I also point out that his world, now he retired in the 1990s, his world was very different from today's retiree. There are certain things that today's retiree must do to be successful in retirement. So there's no cost for the book. All you have to do is text us the word book to our office line, and I'll get that sent over to you right away. The number is 214-988-9178. Again, you'll text the word book to 214-988-9178.